Interdimensional War by Dagaan Galakticos. Chapter 7. Journal entry, January 5th, 2005. We entered into Luev's house through the front door. 3 women in their astral bodies were standing in Luev's living room. Unlike Luev and I, who were in our white robes, these women, who were also in their astral bodies, were dressed in colorful Ovvalan clothes. I should say salon clothes, very stylish. We all stood nervously in front of one another as the introductions took place. First was Elsinad, who Luev has known for some time. She is in her 40s, I would guess. She was extremely cautious when I first entered the room, narrowing her eyes and bending at the waist in a concentration of looking at me. She had her hand tucked inside her clothes in an odd way. Later, I wondered if she had a weapon. There were 2 other women in the room, Kaela and Ovvala. The 3 women stared at me, hard, almost with hostility, but mostly with caution. I felt like I was being X-rayed. The moment of guarded encounter passed, and the 3 women sat down close together on Luev's couch. Luev and I sat together in her big chair. Luev sensed my nervousness and was staying right next to me for reassurance. A glow of love and wonder radiated from Luev as she held my arm. I felt the current of it surge through me and make my heart feel strong. I think the women sensed this. Slowly they seemed to become less guarded. Ovvala was the eldest, in her 50s maybe. She had long dark hair with graying streaks and seemed shy and hesitant, but had a diamond sparkle of craftiness in her eyes. She wore a simple dark dress with curlicues of odd embroidery on it. Kaela was a teenager with a brilliant aura. Wild pulses of mental electricity came out of her unexpectedly, and her eyes darted around the room searchingly. She was tall and dressed in pants and a long shirt with pockets in it like a Russian peasant shirt. She had a large silver shield on a light chain around her neck. It seemed to me that they were calculating how potentially dangerous I might be until Elsinad finally stood up and, smiling at me, indicated for me to do the same. "Jewel, I am pleased to welcome you." She stepped forward and embraced me firmly, and we equalized energies just as Luev and I do. When we touched, there was a short, intense jolt of energy that made us both laugh and feel a little embarrassed. After that, I felt really at ease with her. The other Ovvalan woman then stood and embraced me, and we laughed as we electrocuted each other. Luev did this same thing with each woman, and then we all sat down. Elsinad told us that we were about to travel to a secret place where others were waiting for us. She passed pictures of the journey to each of us and then led us up through the roof of Luev's house and into the sky above Sala and off to the east. I took the chance to study the landscape and saw what could easily be the Sangre de Cristo Mountains where Santa Fe is. If Sala is the counterpart to Santa Fe, it's much bigger, and in Ovvala it's not desert at all. I saw lush fields and forests and a wide-running river. Where the sage is on the plains around Santa Fe, there are endless tall grasses and trees in Ovvala. There was a 3/4 moon, and passing through its light, I felt as though I was moving through light, cool water. We passed over country villages and cobbled roads and more thatched cottages asleep in the moonlight. Lights winked here and there in the dark hollows of the hills as we passed over. I could hear the wind in my ears. We gained altitude and flew faster and faster until we came to a great plain that turned into a dense and dark forest which went on and on until the forest gave way to a shoreline, and then we were over the ocean and came to a land of grassy rolling hills. We descended into a valley with mounds of earth and shelves of cracked rock. There were pastures with stone fences and countryside of hills with small groves of pine or spruce. We landed on a hillside next to some huge old evergreen trees that Luev whispered to me were called fialistra. They are like a narrower and shorter form of spruce. These trees were very magnetic. If I passed my arm along one, the hair on my arm would lift. Well, not the hair, something. The ground was spongy with decaying needles. The moon illuminated the valley clearly. Dormant, leafless oaks grew in the valley where we landed. We stood for a long time without anything happening. Pinhead lights of white and blue flickered around my head, which I figured were some peculiarity of having just traveled so far, but later I thought they could have been astral guards watching our approach. We stood by a large rounded wall of stone that led into a huge mounded hill in a clearing between the oaks where a little stream flowed. We stood silently beneath the ridge, cutting across the stars above us in a long misty valley filled with moonlight. Suddenly a man stepped quickly out of a tree next to us and stood in front of me. He was dressed in a reflective silver suit with what I was sure was a weapon strapped across his chest and which he was touching with his fingers. His eyes were piercing right through my mind. I felt paralyzed. A woman followed him, more slowly, coming out of a different tree. Luev's eyes were big as saucers as she watched these people appear. I had almost pissed in my pants. It was so weird for them to appear like that, except I wasn't wearing pants, but the gauzy white robe. 1 minute, there were 5 of us in the silent woods, and the next minute, there were 7 of us. It was mind-bending. Elsinad and the 2 other women burst into hysterical laughter at this, slapping each other's arms and nearly falling over. Luev and I looked at each other uncertainly. This was the first time we had ever been in the astral with others, and we both felt different, insecure. As the Ovvalan man came more into focus for me, I saw that he was in his 50s and was powerful and serious. He smiled formally at me as he looked me over. The woman had piercing coal black eyes, radiant white skin, and long, black, glistening hair in a thick braid down her back. She was dressed elegantly in an ankle-length dark red robe with flared sleeves, with ornamented cuffs of embroidered hieroglyphics. She, too, was very serious and authoritative. The man was chunky and athletic, a little under 6 feet. He had a menacing presence during the initial first few moments of encounter, but then became detached and unobtrusive. His long Ovvalan face and creased jaws, the coal black hair and oriental, slanted black oval eyes gave him a professional level of menace. The silver bodysuit he wore had an odd geometrical emblem on the shoulder that glowed like it was alive. Even though he was present and fully aware, part of his attention seemed to be separate, checking the spaces beyond us. I could tell that if there was a cause, this guy would use that weapon in a heartbeat. "This is Commander Silvaan of the Siddhe Guard," the woman said with authority. Commander Silvaan and I nodded at one another. Luev said hello. The woman inclined her head at me, saying, "And I am Oorden," and then turned to smile at Luev. A well of intelligence throbbed electrically behind her luminous eyes. She turned to Luev, Elsinad, Kaela, and Ovvala, who had hooked their arms through Luev's in a sisterly way. They giggled softly as though all the seriousness was just too much. They were just like elves, I thought, but not Santa-type elves. These were tricky, dangerous elves that you had to keep an eye on. I saw that Ovvalan women, when they are together, radiate a childlike love that is without any sympathy, as though they can turn their emotions on and off like a faucet. Oorden turned around and looked at me intensely for the longest time without saying a word. I felt her attention poking like fingers around inside me. She was measuring me in some way. Then I realized that Silvaan was doing the same thing in a more subtle way. "This is the most amazing thing I ever saw," Oorden said, looking me over. She shook her head in real awe. They are ready for us now, Silvaan said to the Ovvalan women with a quiet force. Oorden spoke in rapid Ovvalan. Then turning to me, she said, "We are going to a high security zone, and I need you to give me your permission to lead you there in a blackout." I looked at Luev to see what she thought of this. She stepped to my side, looked in my eyes, and held my hand. She trusted them, and I trusted her. "Okay, yes," I said nervously. A darkness like a curtain swallowed the trees, the moonlight, and stars. Luev and I continued to hold hands. We began to move, carried along by what felt like a wind tunnel. We went faster and faster until we came to a standstill and the black curtain rose. We were in a high, domed cavern of solid rock. It was lit by flaming torch sconces on the walls. The floor was covered by thick, ornate Persian carpets. A man dressed in the silver suit of the Siddhe guard nodded briskly and respectfully at Silvaan, ignoring the rest of us, and led us down a long carpeted passageway. We passed something like a gymnasium where some 20 men and women dressed in colorful clothes were practicing archery. They very politely all stood still as we passed and didn't stare at us. After passing many decorated rooms, we came to a luxuriously decorated hall. Burning torches set into the walls of stone lit up a sumptuously decorated room. Ornamental tapestries were fixed to the walls. These carpets depicted historical scenes and had writing on them that looked like a combination of geometric crop circles and Arabic script. I saw St. George spearing what looked like a velociraptor. There was another of naked men and women covered with blue tattoos fighting what looked like tall standing insects, and in another carpet picture there was a sky full of black petrodactyl birds descending over a sea cliff where naked women with tattoos slashed at them with swords. Why did this seem so familiar? As we walked down the long room, I heard music and looked up to see a man dressed in an ornate multicolored robe playing a full-sized harp on a little candle-lit wooden stage. In a far corner, while a woman played an instrument like a didgeridoo, but which made sighing breath sounds like wind. A woodsy, cedar-like incense was in the air. A vortex of magnetic force drew my attention to a woman with pale white skin and red hair sitting erect, as still as a statue, on a majestic throne carved out of the solid trunk of a huge oak which sat atop a thick, flat slab of bluish granite. In a semicircle around the throne were standing a number of powerful-looking people. Each stood in front of tall, ornately ornamented wooden chairs set in a semicircle around the throne. They were luxuriously dressed, each radiating a calm self-possession. They stood formally, with their arms at their sides, as for a meeting of state. Luev and I were led inside this semicircle, and in front of the throne, where two vacant chairs in the center were placed. Each face there stared at us with great curiosity, even fascination. We were both speechless at all of this. Luev looked astounded, very nervous and excited. I felt intimidated by the intense energy I felt coming out of these people. My spine became erect. My skin turned to goosebumps, and sensations like high-quality ecstasy squirted in my brain. A man, dressed in a dark robe of a color I had never seen before, like a pewter mauve, was softly swinging an ornate copper censer that gave off aromatic fumes. Later, I realized that these smoking herbs allowed the people in the physical to see those of us who were in the astral. The astral and the physical were only slightly different here, though I'm still not sure what was really going on. The most arresting person in the group was the red-headed woman seated on the throne. Her light green, almost white eyes blazed with an intensity that actually felt hot when her eyes looked at me and seemed to see from yet another dimension and looked into places inside me I wasn't even aware existed. Her face, white as china plate, glowed from within like moonlight and seemed ageless as a statue, framed by 2 curtains of shining dark red hair. She had the long Ovvalan facial features and the peaked ears. Her skin was so eerily white that she seemed to belong to yet some other category. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't scowling. The expression on her face was undecipherable. She hardly blinked. A sphinx. She was dressed in an emerald green velvet robe with narrow black lapels and flared oriental sleeves embroidered with gold thread, and was sitting sideways on the throne. Her legs crossed and her foot flicking impatiently as her eyes took everything in. This, I thought to myself as I looked at her, is the meaning of supernatural. In her eerily white hands, with their fine, long, white fingers, she held a glowing cobalt blue egg-shaped stone. She passed the stone from hand to hand, continuously caressing it. As she did this, waves of dark purple light radiated out of it in faint glowing waves. She calmly surveyed Luev and I. The rest of the people present, about 10 of them, were intense presences in their own right, especially a tall older man in a charcoal gray robe who radiated a pregnant silence. But the red-headed woman on the throne was so intense it was difficult to look away from her long enough to assess the rest. "We welcome you to Lagana, the inner chamber of the Siddhe," Oorden, in her long blood-red robe, said, gently waving her hands around at the company. "Consuelar Isult," Ovvala said, inclining her chin at the woman on the throne, who cocked her head impatiently. Without attempting to say anything more about her, Oorden went on, "And this is Consuelar Dagaan." Oorden indicated the tall, silent man standing next to Silvaan. He was human and had a beak-like nose, long lined cheeks, and piercing silver eyes. I can't describe how ancient he looked. His skin, like Isult's and like most of the persons around the room, was smooth, hard, and reflective like finely polished leather. They all looked and felt ancient, and yet were not old in the sense of looking wrinkled or worn or tired, because the energy they all radiated together practically hummed. Dagaan nodded with an elegant menace at me. Visible waves of energy pulsed out of him as he did this. There was something untouchable about this Dagaan. He was dressed in a glistening charcoal silver robe with curling spiral bands of faint silver down the sleeves and on the upturned cuffs. He had a reflective silver shield hung around his neck with hieroglyphics on it. The intense quiet that radiated out of him made him seem to be not wholly there, and yet when I looked into the shadow of his eyes, I was startled to encounter what felt like the razor's edge of a consciousness that then subtly withdrew. "Welcome, Joseph," he said, nodding at me. His voice was low, soft, and penetrating. "Welcome, Lueva Nalia," he said, turning to Luev and bowing his head toward her. This was the first time I had heard Luev's last name. Luev nodded, her head visibly quivering on her neck, her eyes staring in disbelief. The man next to Dagaan was black like a Hindu, tall and athletically and calmly aware. He wore a tan and black striped robe with ivory cuffs on the flared sleeves. He had a long necklace of many stranded, glinting black seed pods around his neck. "Consuelar Idima," Oorden said, and a deep, slow smile revealing pearly white teeth opened on the man's ancient face. I felt a series of loving electrical pulses radiate out of him towards us. Oorden then nodded across to the other side of the semicircle to the radiant young woman dressed in a fringed white deerskin dress that hung to her ankles. Consuelar Tantala White Buffalo, Oorden said. A tall, strikingly beautiful and young, perhaps a teenage American native woman with bronze-like skin similar to Loeve's own coloring, smiled softly at us and inclined her head. Lights like vanishing lightning flashed out of her black eyes. A quail or pheasant feather stuck out of her black hair, and necklaces of colored seeds glimmered across her breast. Next to her was a huge, muscular woman with a springy mane of curly ant-red hair and huge, naked, meaty, stick-out tits. A thick white leather shoulder strap holding a silver sword across her chest. Her nipples were so large that her shoulder band was snagged on one. Bodicea, Oorden said forcefully. This woman had eyes like an angry pig and had engraved bronze shield on her shins and a thick triangular piece of engraved bronze over the crotch of her leather skirt. She stood with an impatient defiance, sneering at everyone, and bounced on her heels, making her tits catapult as she stared at us. "Yet!" she yelled. Her smile was more like a sneer and seemed to hurt her face. There was an extremely black woman I am encoded not to otherwise describe. Asalen, Oorden said next, indicating the man in the silver uniform who had greeted Silvaan earlier. He was younger than Silvaan and also wore the silver weapon. He nodded formally like a salute. Oorden then introduced the rest of the group, whom I have also been encoded to not describe. For some time we all stood in silence. The soft tones of the harp and wind tube played nearly inaudible music, and the man with the incense burner worked the smoke. The aromatic and transparent fumes didn't rise but sank to the floor and collected upwards in bands as the torch fires flickered and snapped. Sudden, in rapid-fire bursts of carefully articulated words that mixed Ovvalan and English seamlessly, Isult, the eerie woman on the throne, spoke. Her accent sounded Irish or French to me. "It is apparent to us that a powerful vortex of energy has come through in the meeting of the two of you. We see the hand of one of our circle who has been away for a long time, and you're coming together." She looked with deep love and tenderness at Loev, which made Loev take deep, slow, gasping breaths. "Ea milicen serat havia kin tel deva mert rea skol." Isult spoke in Ovvalan to the room at large, but particularly to the tall Dagaan, who slowly nodded his head. Then Isult went on. Her voice, like her eyes, made me feel painfully awake. Her voice started a sense of motion like the wind gathering force before a storm. "It is necessary for you to understand something of the energetic construct you're in before we can begin to communicate to you who and what we are and what is going on here. There is much you cannot know about us. This is a talking stone." Her words had a soft shattering effect as she indicated the egg-shaped blue stone cradled in her palm. "Among other things, the history of Mahala is written in this stone. We will listen to its transmission together. Please be seated." Everyone sat down. An emotion I cannot describe began to fill the room. It was like a religious ceremony had begun. Isult cupped the blue stone in both her hands and became again as still as when we had first entered the room, hardly seeming to breathe. The waves of purple-blue energy streaming off the stone intensified and carried information straight into the center of my brain. I heard a strong, very articulate, low woman's voice begin to speak. It spoke patiently and impersonally, as you might hear an announcement at an airport. Everyone in the room was riveted to this voice and seemed to go into a similar trance as Isult. Taking steady, deep breaths, I soon did so myself. Interdimensional war